Don't go under contract until you have the most recent mortgage statement. It's unbelievable how many transactions we've done where the seller is like $20,000 behind on payments and nobody knew. And they're expecting to get a bunch of money at closing. You think you're getting into this deal for close to nothing. That's going to change your numbers by a lot, because when you take over someone's mortgage, it has to be brought current first.
Perla, thank you for joining me for our Thought Leader Spotlight series. I'm your host over here, Matt Kamp, head of partnerships at DealMachine. And on these, we really like to shine an industry spotlight on experts like yourself, hear your inspiring stories, and see how you see the world evolving. So today, really excited to welcome on Perla Argyle. I know you had an interesting journey to get into real estate. You were a teacher for 7 years. You've got a master's in math. You were a health coach. You refurnished furniture. So you did all kinds of different industries. And now completely went self-employed into the real estate investing world. So I think you really would fit a bucket that a lot of our audience is going through right now as well, trying to get to that transition. I know you're a TC, a transactions coordinator, with over 300 transactions completed. And now you've built tcdealpros.com, which with up to, I think, 5 employees now in your business, right?
Yeah, 5.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Awesome. So welcome on, Perla. Thanks for coming on. Excited to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Yeah, can you tell us more, just to kind of start off with, I know I read your bio a little bit, but tell us more about that journey of how you got into this and how you found real estate, how you became an entrepreneur, fully self-employed in real estate too.
Yeah, actually, I kind of became a real estate investor by accident. I got divorced at one point, and my husband was like, "I'm not living in that house. You live there with another guy." And I'm like, "But the mortgage is so cheap. I don't want to sell this house," Not to mention, he's a bit of I could tell he was more of a spender, not much of a saver. I'm already thinking like, this has to be our retirement egg. Let's just leave it as a rental. And he had just finished school, so he had tons of student debt. So I was like, if we just rent this out, that cash flow will literally pay for your student loans every month. So he's like, okay. And I was like, after a while, I was like, this whole passive income thing is really cool. So then when we bought our first house together, we were going to leave because we were just he was switching jobs. And same thing, I'm like, let's leave it as a rental. Why not? It's a great house. It's a great location. We would retire in this town. We ended up loving there. And again, we just kept leaving houses as rentals. And I'm like, you know what? We need to do this more. Like, how do people do this all the time? How do people have 70 rentals? I don't get it. We're thinking we'll buy one every 5 years if we save up. And I started learning, what do you mean OPM? How do you use other people's money to buy houses? That just blew my mind. And I just started researching. And of course, when you start researching, your phone is listening. So then it's all over your Instagram and Facebook ads, follow this guru, follow this guru. And that's kind of how I started in real estate. And like I said, kind of just by accident. It wasn't planned. But I was like, this is awesome. Let's do it again. And let's use other people's money this time.
Awesome. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that with our audience. I mean, can you tell us a little bit more? I know you speak on sometimes really kind of that fear of the unknown. And, I know you kind of got over that and started cold calling and really, went full into this. So what was that journey like? How did you get the confidence to really jump full into this?
Yeah, I mean, truth be told, I'm a very outgoing person, so I wasn't necessarily scared of talking to people. I love talking to people. But what was the fear that I had is there's so much training on how to close a deal, how to structure a deal, how to talk to sellers. But there's so little training on what happens, because it's not like the sexy stuff. What happens when they say yes? Mm-hmm. It's okay, what do I do now? And that was that fear that was holding me back. What happens when I finally get a seller to say yes? And I was definitely letting that hold me back, because people would always say, oh, you just get a TC. And everybody I would ask, you just get a TC. And I'm like, what does that mean? I'm like, I need to know, what does a TC do? I need those details. So I started looking into it. I started taking some trainings. I'm like, you know what? I think I might like doing this. So I took like a month-long training on how to TC. I did 4 transactions just interning for another TC company. And I was like, okay, I think I know what I'm doing now. Let's go out and do it. So
Yeah.
here I am. Like, it was about a year. It was in January. So a year later, I did about 300 transactions.
Wow. Congrats. That's
Thank
amazing.
you.
That's so true. That's very relatable. Like, I mean, I think we have people on here all the time talking about how to speak to sellers, how to, how to go through that. And then, like you said, when they say yes, it's not an area that people focus on as much. So can
Yeah.
you give us a little bit of a crash course for the newbies here around like, what happens after they say yes? What does that process look like? How best practices around that? And then what a TC is.
What happens after they say yes? What happens is you're going to want to send them a contract. Once everybody signs the contract, then that's when there's a transaction. That's when, if you decide to get a TC, that's when you want to get them involved. A TC can't, well, TCs should not write contracts for you because it should be like done by the buyer or an attorney. We happen to have an attorney on our TC team who can do that for you, which is really awesome. So you open escrow. You always want to make sure that you have a title company that is very investor friendly. Like, they know assignments. They do assignments. They're okay with sending assignments to JV partners. Like, we're dealing with one where this attorney will not send the assignment fee to more than one person, even though there's 4 JV partners. She's like, sorry, I can only send it to one person. And we're like, what? Like, you have the contracts. You're supposed to follow instructions. So you open escrow. The title company they're going to take your EMD deposit. They're going to go ahead and order a title search. And it could be anywhere from like 7 to 20 pages long that you're going to have to review. It's going to tell you what liens are on the property, if there's any code violations on the property, just everything. It's going to tell you the chain of title, all of that. Super important to review. They're going to want things like LLC documents, any addendums, JV agreements. They're going to draft the settlement statement or the HUD for you. So those are all kind of things that happen after they say yes. And it's a lot of emailing. It's a lot of detail. It's a lot of problem solving. It's very rare we do a transaction that doesn't have some kind of dumpster fire. That's what I say. Every deal is just a dumpster fire waiting to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in the business of problem solving, like you said. Like, the bigger the problem you solve, the bigger the payoff, right? The more value you're bringing.
Yeah, and I think that kind of distinguishes a good TC from just a paper pusher. Anybody can say, "Hey, title, can you please open escrow? Here's the contract." Anybody can do that. A 15-year-old could do that. But when the problems arise, can a TC say, "Hey, we've got these liens on the property. Why don't we go back to the seller and let's say it's a creative finance and there's supposed to be like 20,000 seller finance, and say, hey, there's a $10,000 lien on this. You won't budge on your cash to seller. Why don't we just reduce the seller finance amount by $10,000?" That's where it's like the difference between a good TC and a paper pusher. Can they help you problem solve those issues?
Yeah. How long is that process typically too? Just for our audience?
So if it's a cash transaction, I would say give it 2 weeks just to be safe, because people are slow. The sellers might be motivated, but when they have to actually do something, it really slows down. You're like, don't you want to get paid? I would say 2 weeks for a cash transaction is pretty solid. And then if there's an HOA, don't do less than 2 weeks, because it usually takes a good 10 days for HOA transfer documents to come through. If it's a creative deal, I always say plan for 30 days. And also, if you're going to have an assignment, also plan for closer to a month, because you're going to have to find the buyer. It's just going to be a little more people involved is going to just add to that timeline.
Makes
Unless
sense.
you already have a buyer when you open escrow.
Fair. If say you're a newbie investor trying to do that first deal, or, maybe you're scaling a little bit, you've done a few, but, are trying to do more. When is the right time to look at outsourcing a TC or hiring a TC or bringing one on? Like, can you do it for your first deal, or what are kind of how do you evaluate that?
Yeah, great question. I absolutely recommend on your first deal having a TC, because you don't know what to expect. You don't know what to look for. You don't know what title's supposed to be doing versus what you're supposed to be doing. Like, you have no idea what to do. You're like, well, I got them to say yes. I can get my money now, right? Or I can get my house. Like that's all you know. So definitely on your first transaction, it's just going to give you the confidence that it's going to finish, it's going to be on time, and you're not going to miss something. Absolutely. If you're doing 2 or 3, maybe even 4 deals a month, and you feel like you're keeping up, you can probably do without. You'll be okay, unless you absolutely hate being in your emails. If you're allergic to emails, always use a TC. But if you're trying to scale, absolutely. I mean, I have one client, I don't think he'd mind. He actually said really good things about DealMachine. He's like, that's one of the few softwares that I would vet. Like, they are good. His name is Chris Allen. Chris Allen.
Okay.
He has a Joe Homebuyer franchise with Jerry Norton. He's an amazing guy. Yeah. He's like one of my BFFs now. But he's one of my clients, and his team, we have probably 10 to 15 transactions open with him at any time. And my team is probably spending collectively 30 hours a week just working on his transactions, if not more. So imagine if his team now has to work an extra 30 hours to do what we're doing for him. So at that point, if you're trying to scale, it's just about winning your time back.
Absolutely. When you are a newbie, if you're trying to do it yourself that first time, what are some of the most common mistakes you see? Like when you say hey, I just the process, like you said, you've seen so many things. What are those kind of things that you see that are easy to miss?
Not knowing how to read a title commitment, not knowing how to read a settlement statement. I've noticed a lot of wholesalers, they just okay, my fee is correct. There's a lot more to a HUD or a settlement statement than just your assignment fee. There's so much more. So, things like that. And we do a lot. Most of what we do is creative financing, is those subject to transactions. Those are obviously a lot more complicated. So guiding your buyers, or if you're the buyer, on how to set up the insurance afterwards, what kind of authorization forms and power of attorney forms, which we draft for you, you're going to need so you can take over the mortgage, how to make sure you're mitigating your risks for the due on sale clause and how to reduce those risks. All of those are things and conversations that if you've never done a deal, you're not going to know that you're supposed to do it. I have people come back and they're like, oh, I did a subject to deal. How do I log in? I never got that information. I don't have a power attorney. I'm like, did you use a TC? They're like, no, I didn't want to pay for one. So, which is, it's understandable if you don't realize the value that we can provide. But
yeah. And does that vary, based on the state you're in terms of the TC process, and is there any nuance there in terms of the transaction itself, or?
At this point, I don't feel like there really is. There are some there's attorney states and there's title states. The attorney states tend to be slower. Working with attorneys, they're just by nature slower because they want to just more carefully dot all the I's and cross all the T's. I would say working New York and New Jersey is I would say it's a lot more difficult, because you're going to have the seller's going to have an attorney, the buyer has to have an attorney, and there's going to be a closing attorney. So trying to get 3 attorneys to agree to anything, makes a deal a lot more complicated, and especially on a creative transaction. But other than that, I honestly don't feel like it's that different. There are title companies that just have their own forms and their own way they like to have things done. That's just more office specific as opposed to state specific.
Mm-hmm.
I do think one thing that is important to keep in mind is look up if your state is a mutual release state. So, for instance, the contracts we use say, if we cancel during inspection period, we get our EMD back with no further signatures needed. But even though the seller is signing that, some title companies in mutual release states say, sorry, you still have to have them sign to get your EMD back. So little things like that, I think, vary per state. And again, some of that is just that particular title company's policies.
Makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. I know you brought up creative finance a few times, and that's something that we've heard, especially since interest rates have gone up and, there's extremely low mortgages that are out there. It's just like an environment that makes sense that creative finance has gotten so much more popular.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice on newbies approaching creative finance since it is more complicated of a transaction? Like, I'd love to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of tips from the transaction coordinator. Don't go under contract until you have the most recent mortgage statement. It's unbelievable how many transactions we've done where the seller is like $20,000 behind on payments and nobody knew. So now and they're expecting to get a bunch of money at closing. You think you're getting into this deal for close to nothing. That's going to change your numbers by a lot, because when you take over someone's mortgage, it has to be brought current first. Mm-hmm. So always get the most recent mortgage statement before you go under contract. Verify that they're up to date. And if they're not, okay, restructure the deal. It's an easier conversation to have now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I would say that's one of the biggest tips. Mm-hmm. Probably the best one I can think of right now.
Love that. Yeah. No, I mean, it's super helpful. I mean, we hear, I know people who are watching this, they might hear like sub 2, novation, skater, like all these terms that are, kind of not a straightforward transaction. So it's something that, can be really powerful, but also can get complicated, and you got to, know what you're doing a little bit there. Right.
Yeah. And I would advise, if you are doing your first subject to transaction, to get a JV partner who has done a lot of them. Because they especially like trying to close a deal, there's going to be so many questions that your seller is going to have that you might not know. Like, I have a guy who just got one under contract, and I said, we can't get involved until he has signed a sub 2 addendum. And I sent him like a very simple one. It's not like the one we use in sub 2, because he's not in the sub 2 membership. And the seller was like, I'm not signing this. I'm like, any buyer is not going to be okay with them not signing. Like it says, my loan's not paid off. This is still on my credit. There is something called a due on sale clause. Like, your seller has to know those things, So definitely making sure the right paperwork is there is it could really save your deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is super helpful, Perla. I really, really appreciate you coming on. And this is such a unique topic. Like, love to have you back on that. I know our audience, probably, like you said, probably hears much more on like talking about sales and everything, not about the nitty gritty steps on the transaction itself. So, I think, and because of it's the unknown, like, because we haven't gone through it, I think it can be a big hesitation for a lot of newbies to be a little intimidated by that transaction, right? So, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing that with our audience today. What's the best way for people to get involved with you? I know you had mentioned potentially hooking us up with a little, discount, was it? Or tell me what you help there.
Yeah, absolutely. You guys can go to TC Deal Pros. The S it's plural, tcdealpros.com. It'll tell you all our prices on there. It'll tell you everything that we offer. It's all super laid out. It's a phenomenal website. It's super awesome. You can even submit your deal right on there. Tell us all about your deal. You can upload the contract, and then it'll have you book a call directly with me. You can even have us request a contract write-up right on the website. It's amazing. And for everybody that comes in through DealMachine, it'll ask you like who referred you. You put DealMachine, and we're going to give you guys 10% off of your first transaction, which is going to be awesome. And if you're wholesaling, what we always do is we always charge half up front and then half at closing. If it doesn't close, you don't get paid, we don't get paid. But we also, if it does close and you're wholesaling, we charge the second half to the end buyer. Because once the end buyer's there, everything we're doing is in their benefit. So we never really get pushback on that, but it saves you half of the fees.
Love that. Yeah. And thank you so much for being a resource for our community and offering that.
Yeah.
And appreciate you coming on again today. So
yeah, it was so fun to be here. Anytime, you guys, if you're okay with me being here, I'll be here.
Deal. All right. Well, thanks again. Really enjoyed the conversation. To everyone watching, again, this is Matt Kamp with DealMachine, and happy deal finding.